Hello and welcome to the July 2023 issue of the Zavitz and Sykora Financial Strategies video newsletter. Thank you for tuning in and listening to our update. I'm your advisor, Greg Sykora. Unfortunately, Mark won't be joining us because he's having some computer troubles, so I'll be presenting to you solo today. Today, I'm going to quickly go over what's driving this amazing rebound we've been seeing in stock market returns and your portfolios year to date. Where we are from an inflation standpoint, as well as covering Canada's scary lagging productivity numbers. And then finally, after that, I'm going to talk about cottage financial planning and ways you can think about planning to keep the cottage or vacation property in the family, as well as the tax consequences of those various strategies and passing the cottage down to your family or your kids. So let's review performance real quickly. Most of you are in one of these model portfolios on this screen. We can see the year-to-date performance of the very conservative, the conservative, the moderate growth, and the growth portfolio models. And as you can see, based off of these numbers, the returns are quite strong on a year-to-date basis. The very conservative portfolio, which has around 30% stocks inside the portfolio, that has a year-to-date return of around 4.37%. The conservative portfolio, which is closer to around 50% stocks, 50% bonds, that has around a 6% return. The moderate growth portfolio, which is around 65% stocks, around 35% bonds, that's around a 7.5% return. And the growth portfolio on a year-to-date basis, that has over a 10% return. So quite strong returns. Equity markets have been doing extremely well. But why is that? So what has been driving these returns? Well, a normalization of inflation. Central bankers across North America, Asia, Europe, after analyzing the recent economic data that's been coming out, have all come to the same conclusion that inflation has been slowing, and we appear to be getting very close to our central bankers' inflation targets. Those targets for most central bankers, especially the ones in North America, in Canada, and the United States, that's a target of a 2% inflation level. But anything between a 2 and a 3% number, like what we're seeing on the screen here for Canada and the United States, is considered a normal level. And stock markets absolutely love this because it means that we appear to be at the end of them increasing interest rates or this high interest rate environment. Remember, stock markets are looking forward 6 to 12 months. And so many interest rate sensitive stocks, such as those in the tech sector, they love the idea of cheaper capital to fuel growth, and they're booming right now. That coupled with the fact that many companies are doing better than expected from an earnings standpoint, based off of things like their investment in AI. And that's really been what's been the huge catalyst for driving stock markets. And if you recall, and if you remember, this time a year ago when we sent out our first video newsletter, we were talking about inflation. And for most of these countries, inflation levels were in a range of between 7 to 10%. Canada and the United States were respectively around 8 to 9% levels. So this has been a significant deceleration. It's been exactly what central bankers have been looking for, and conversely, whatever the stock market's been looking for as well, and that's really been what's been driving performance. And what else is news? Well, if you read the Globe and Mail or if you read the National Post, like me, one of the main things that some journalists have been highlighting has been Canada's productivity problems, as well as the productivity numbers that have been coming out and how they seem to be getting worse and worse every year. Here's a nice graph I found that supports these articles. I didn't find it in a Globe article or in a National Post article. I found it independent of that. But it was in an article that basically stack ranked the productivity of the Canadian provinces with the US states. And basically the conclusion of the article is that Canada looks like it's in trouble. These numbers are pretty bad. They're getting worse and worse from a productivity standpoint every single year. And that it would be nice if our politicians focused on trying to improve this productivity number. So what's really been driving these productivity numbers? Well, here's a few reasons why our productivity numbers are significantly worse than most US states. First, our unemployment rate is higher in Canada than it is in the US. We're around a 5.7, 5.8% unemployment level, whereas they're at a 3.6% overall countrywide unemployment level. So they have more people working. We have higher tax rates in Canada, and our average consumer has significantly more debt, which also hurts productivity. And as Canadians, we get a lot of free stuff. We get a lot of free money for nothing from the government, and this promotes things like part-time work, which in part leads to lower overall productivity. And when you look at where we rank relative to all the other G8 countries, well, our productivity is actually the lowest. And so a lot of people wonder why it feels like Canada is falling behind. And that's because, to put it bluntly, our productivity kind of sucks. Productivity improves through things like competition, technological innovation, or government incentives or policies that encourage people to work more. And when people are more productive, they're making more money, and the country as a whole is more prosperous. So not good news for Canada. Now here's a cool timeline piece that also speaks to productivity as well as global GDP growth. And I found it on a website called Visual Capitalist, and it just stack ranks the world's top 15 economies as well as their trajectories. Canada, as I said, was ranked 8th, and you can see that here. And what I found, to be kind of sad is the fact that Canada appears to be falling in ranks as time goes on. And what was interesting actually to me is that we're seeing the emergence of some African countries such as Egypt and Nigeria as they grow, because they've got populations that are growing significantly, and they eventually become larger economic powerhouses. These are countries that have some of the highest population growth in the world, as I was saying. And so this chart obviously makes sense to me. What will be interesting for you and your investment portfolio is that these countries have very little to no representation in the stocks or bonds that you own. And I would fully expect over the next 15, 20, 25 years for these countries to be part of the emerging market portion of your portfolio inside some of your funds, and for you to actually start to own some companies that are domiciled domiciled and are part of Egypt or the Nigerian economies. So to the succession planning strategies for your cottage or vacation property. So perhaps maybe I should start with a quick disclaimer. Before you do any cottage planning, I think it's important that your kids, that you loop your kids in, and that they actually want the cottage. And remember, on top of opening and closing the cottage, the responsibilities of owning a cottage include paying property taxes and maintenance, as well as upkeep, and doing all that on a regular yearly basis. So you should really be sitting down and having a discussion, I think, with your kids, with your intentions, and being open about your estate planning. And I think that's especially important if your kids are in a position where they can't afford this vacation property or this cottage that they may inherit. But assuming that they're interested in inheriting the cottage, here are 4 succession planning strategies you may want to consider, and that we're happy to discuss with you if you're considering doing any cottage succession planning for yourself. The first strategy, and this is one that actually comes across my desk and Mark's desk quite often, involves transferring the cottage out of the parents' ownership into joint ownership with the kids. It's one of the easier strategies to implement, but it comes with a set of pros and cons that I've listed here. First, changing ownership would be initiated through a conversation with your lawyer. But the main consideration to have is that the moment you transfer the cottage to your kids, a deemed disposition will occur, and you're going to trigger some capital gains. Now, triggering capital gains today might be a good idea. For example, like if there's a lot of development happening around your cottage and you foresee, the value of your cottage hockey sticking over the next decade or so, it might make good financial planning sense to trigger those gains and to transfer the ownership of the cottage to your kids. It might be smart financial planning, but giving ownership to your kids comes with a ton of potential issues. First, you may not actually want to trigger the tax or the capital gains because the tax or capital gains bill might be quite high. Two, now that your kids become owners, their money problems can now affect you, such as if they have, say, creditor or debt problems. The cottage could become an asset that they're forced to sell. Or if your kids are having, say, marital problems, their stake in the cottage could become part of the matrimonial asset divide. But most importantly, as a parent, when you move a cottage into joint ownership with your kids, the moment the kid actually has ownership of the cottage, you lose control, and legally your kids can do whatever it is the heck they want to do with the cottage. So they can put it up for sale or their portion of the cottage up for sale the next day. And in most cases, there's absolutely nothing you can do about it. And that's why I caution anyone who's doing any cottage succession planning to think twice about transferring the cottage in joint ownership with their kids. Second strategy involves transferring the cottage to a trust. There's lots of different kinds of trusts that can be used in this case, but the most popular trust is what's known as, for this purpose of transferring cottages, what's known as a living family trust, which is what I've highlighted on the screen on this slide. So the trust can be set up, a living family trust can be set up in such a way that the parents retain control of the cottage, they become trustees, and the kids are set up as beneficiaries to receive the cottage when the parents pass. The first thing to know is that transferring the cottage into a living family trust immediately triggers a capital gain, very similar to transferring direct ownership or a portion of the ownership to your kids. The second thing to consider is that the trust is creditor proof and private, which means it's not part of your will or part of your estate, which can be a good thing. And for as long as the cottage remains in the trust, it also would not form part of your kids' matrimonial assets, which is also something you may want to consider as one of the benefits of using the trust. Moving a cottage into a trust does remove it from the estate, as I was saying, so there's no probate fees that would be associated with it. For example, if you have a cottage with a market value or a vacation property with a market value of $1 million, that would mean on death of the second spouse that the probate fees associated with that cottage being part of the estate would be, at least in Ontario, in the ballpark of $15,000. The main disadvantages of using a trust is that you need to set up a trust through a lawyer. There's ongoing filing that needs to be done because the trust is a separate tax entity. So there's yearly tax filing requirements, and that those, they're not overly expensive, but they do add up over time. And of course, as I was saying, could also be a con when you trigger a capital gain. When you move a cottage into a trust, it triggers the immediate capital gain, which means you could be paying a lot of tax upfront. The third strategy is the simplest strategy of them all, and that involves using insurance. All you simply do is, or we would do together, is simply estimate the cost of how much tax there's going to be and what the overall cost of transferring the cottage would be to your kids in the future. And that's something that Mark and I can do for you. And then we buy enough insurance to cover those cottage costs using a permanent insurance policy that triggers on the death of the second spouse. So the benefit to all this is that there's no trust being set up. There's no need to really involve a lawyer where you're transferring ownership. The parents get to keep control of the cottage until they die. The bad part about this strategy is that it involves the cottage remaining part of the estate. So it remains part of the parents' estate. There's going to be a probate fee associated with the cottage. The parents Both need to be insurable, and the permanent insurance policy over time can be quite expensive depending on the age in which it's set in force, as well as the size of the death benefit of the policy that you're looking, or that we would come up with when doing planning for you. And the final strategy, this one's a little bit of an outside of the box strategy. It involves selling the cottage to your kids. And one of the ways you can trigger the gains inside of your cottage, but lower the overall tax bill, is by spreading those gains over a 5-year period. So in Canadian taxes, we have a special rule that's known as the capital gains reserve. This means that for capital property or entities like a cottage, or like even like an incorporated business, you can transact and sell the cottage to your kids over the course of 5 years. That ultimately means spreading the capital gain and the capital gains tax that you would owe over a 5-year period when your kids buy it from you. And what you can do is, if as your kids give you the value of the cottage over a 5-year period in 20% tranches, you can then re-gift them back the money that they've paid the cottage, because there's no rule against paying the cottage money back to the kids and giving them this as their inheritance. There's no tax rules associated with that. And so ultimately, if you want to be really nice to them, you can pay for the tax bill, spread it out over 5 years, and transfer the ownership of the cottage to your kids, while doing your best to minimize the overall tax liability that will be incurred. This is a more advanced strategy, definitely one you'd want to talk to Mark and I about, and have us ultimately run by with an accountant to see if it makes sense for you. And with that, that wraps up our monthly newsletter update. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening to our 4 cottage succession planning strategies. This is the disclaimer. I'm going to keep on. Hope you're having a great summer. Feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions or concerns. And we look forward to sending you our next video update next month. Thanks.